It's a great pleasure to be asked to speak at an event like this for such a wonderful organisation and what looks like a really great programme that you've put together. So real pleasure to talk to you today, albeit remotely, on girls and women on the autism spectrum. So I'm going to start off with a very brief introduction to autism. And by the way, I tend not to use the word autism spectrum disorder, even though it's in the diagnostic manuals. I think the word disorder perhaps makes an unhelpful assumption. So although I use the phrase ASD here just to be clear about that I am talking about the construct that's written into DSM-5, I tend to use the word autism instead. So very brief introduction to autism. I know that the audience today will be very knowledgeable on this topic, but just a couple of slides to make sure that we're all kind of starting from a sort of shared understanding. And then going to move on to think about what is the gender ratio in autism, because many conversations about men and women and girls and boys with autism start with consideration of the gender ratio in autism. And I'm going to ask, is there a diagnostic bias against autistic females? I'm then going to go on to have a think about individual characteristics of females with autism. And that's going to lead to some consideration of what's been called the female autism phenotype. So this idea that there's a gender-specific, a female-specific way in which autism manifests that's different in important and consistent and meaningful ways from how autism manifests on average in males. Then we'll have a think about the impact on diagnosis of the female phenotype. And I may well briefly outline some sort of future research directions, although I am very keen to leave time for some questions that I believe will be emailed across the Atlantic to me at the end of the session. Okay, so what is autism? Well, there's two kind of answers to that question, and one of them is a slightly uncomfortable answer, which is that we don't actually know what autism is. You know, there's this atypicality of brain function and structure that is autism, but we don't know what that is actually, which is another way of saying we don't have a biomarker for autism. So what do? You know, we sort of believe there's this thing called autism. We don't know precisely what it is in terms of you know, how it involves the brain working somewhat differently to in non-autistic people, but we nevertheless want to identify autistic people so that we can perhaps offer them support if they need it, and learn more about autism. And so what do? Well, we do what pretty much every other psychiatric disorder or diagnosis does, which is if we can't see the thing itself, we think about how does it manifest in terms of overt behaviors, which is to say, what are the signs and symptoms of autism, the observable manifestations of it? And that's just another word for diagnostic criteria. Yeah. So really, if you think about it, diagnostic criteria represent a sort of working hypothesis that a particular set of behaviors and experiences signify this sort of mysterious and unidentified thing, which a medic might call a disease entity, although I would be resistant to the notion that autism is a disease, but the sort of underlying atypicality. And what are the diagnostic criteria for autism? Well, there's a high degree of agreement about that. There's this notion that autism manifests as really a cluster of symptoms that come in two forms. Yeah, some of them are essentially social. They're to do with social reciprocity and social communication. So, you know, for example, unusual or difficulties forming relationships, maybe difficulties with social communication, back and forth conversation, and so on. And then the other type of autistic symptom are these, what I call the non-social elements of autism, the repetitive and restricted interests and behaviors, these collection of characteristics, some of which are strengths, some of which can cause difficulties, that are to do with inflexibility, resistance to change, and also atypical sensory processing. Now, here's another important idea about what autism is. So, back in the day, probably I would say right up until about the turn of the millennium, certainly in the UK, there was a consensus that autism was a categorical condition. It was something that you either had or you didn't have. And so, a good example of a categorical condition is Down syndrome. You either have Down syndrome or you don't have Down syndrome. We're not all on a Down syndrome spectrum. And what's become clear is that autism almost certainly isn't a categorical disorder. Actually, it's a dimensional disorder, which is to say, it represents the extreme of a trait distribution that actually extends throughout the population. So, in a sense, we're all somewhere on this distribution of autistic characteristics, autistic traits, but above a certain cut point, and it must be said, an arbitrary cut point, we by convention label people as being autistic, as having autism. So it exists at the extreme of a continuum that extends through the general population. That's what I mean when I describe it as a dimensional disorder. So, as we know from really since the 1970s, autism is highly heritable. So therefore, where you are on that autism trait distribution is pretty strongly controlled by your genes. Although it is also influenced by the environment. That is true. It's not totally controlled by genetics. We think it occurs by current definitions in about 1% of the population. Although it should be noted that recently certain American estimates, the CDC estimates, have suggested it may be even more common than that. It's associated with intellectual disability in half to a third of cases, and it's almost always associated with additional neurodevelopmental, cognitive, behavioral, emotional challenges. So autism, although we talk of it as a difficulty of social and non-social symptoms, it almost always comes along with other sort of difficulties. Now, I'm thinking, for example, of high rates of co-occurring emotional difficulties or language difficulties and so on. Okay, so that's my kind of whistle-stop tour of autism. So now let's move on to this interesting question. What is the gender ratio in autism? And this was a question that a student of mine, Rachel Looms, decided to investigate. And in order to do that, she did what we call a meta-analysis. So this is where you statistically combine the results from lots of different published findings to create a kind of uber study, a mega study that draws on multiple different studies in order to give you a more precise estimate of what you're interested in than you could get just from looking at one study in isolation. And she did a meta-analysis of epidemiological studies of autism, so studies where people had tried to estimate the prevalence of autism in the general population. And she was interested in the male to female ratio in those studies. And she collected together, actually, systematically searching 54 studies with a combined sample of nearly 14 million young people. And prepare yourself for a rather busy slide, but don't worry, because there's only really a couple of pieces of information you need to get from it. And the first one is the one in this red box here. So this table just shows you all the different studies, but the bit at the bottom is the kind of summary of their findings. And what you can see here is that the average gender ratio across all these 14 million people was just over 4-1. 4 males for every female on the autism spectrum. So that was her sort of overall result there. But there's something else important here that I want to draw your attention to, which is a little bit technical, but it's important. And it's this I-squared statistic here. So what that means, that 91%, that's very high. And what it means is there was a tremendous amount of variability between the different studies. Basically, some of the studies got a high male to female ratio, some got a lower one, some got, many got in between. So there was a lot of variability in the estimates that the studies came back with as to what the male to female ratio was in autism. And that's interesting because we can then study what's associated with that variability. And one important variable associated with that is whether it's to do with the method by which cases were identified in these studies. So in an epidemiological study, you can kind of basically take one of two approaches to case ascertainment. You can take a passive case ascertainment approach, where you go out into a community and you try and find everyone who already has an autism diagnosis. Perhaps you look at school records, health records, you call up parents and say, does your child have an autism diagnosis? Yeah, that's passive case ascertainment. And that can be contrasted with active case ascertainment. So this is where you don't just rely on people already having been diagnosed. You go out into a population, you screen people, and you try and identify every case of autism in that population, regardless of whether or not they already have a diagnosis. Yeah. So you can identify cases that haven't been picked up, but which nevertheless meet criteria for autism. And we compared the male to female ratio in these two different types of sample and found an intriguing contrast. So in the passive case ascertainment studies, the studies where they just looked for people who had a pre-existing autism diagnosis, there was a high male to female ratio, 4.5 to 1. And in the active case ascertainment studies, it was much lower, just 3 females to 1 male. Now, what we can infer from that is that there's a bunch of females out there who, if you assess them, you screen a population, you try and pick them up, and then you assess them carefully with a proper, well-conducted autism assessment, they will score up for having autism. Yeah, but they're not making it into clinical samples. And that's why females are more strongly represented in these active case ascertainment studies than in these passive case ascertainment studies that relied on people who'd already basically been picked up by education and clinical systems. So that to me is evidence for an interesting bias, a bias whereby you have females who would meet criteria for autism if you assess them, but who are for one reason or another not being identified and presumably therefore not receiving the sorts of support and help that often comes, although not always comes, with a diagnosis. Now, there's another part to this story. Now, you remember I mentioned that autism was a dimensional disorder that effectively represents the extreme of a distribution of traits that go through the general population. But what happens if you identify males and females, not by using diagnostic criteria, but instead by measuring autistic traits in the general population and by identifying those who are very, very high scorers for those traits, who score in the top 1% of the population, yeah, who by sort of conventional definitions you would think, well, okay, that's probably autism, isn't it, if they're very, very high scorers on autism trait measures. So if you do that, you don't get a male to female ratio of 4 to 1, you don't get a male to female ratio of 3 to 1, you get a male to female ratio of 2 to 1. So you find proportionally many more females in studies if you ascertain them, not by using diagnostic criteria, but by looking for extreme high scorers on autistic traits. So, and this is quite a widespread finding. You can see there's a couple of references there, and I've sort of referenced that in this first bullet point. So there's something going on here whereby there appears to be a group of females who have very severe autistic difficulties, both social and non-social difficulties, i.e. who score very high on autistic trait measures, but who even when you actively assess them for autism, they don't score up. They don't meet criteria. And that's sort of that sort of inference I take from comparing the 2 to 1 gender ratio to the 3 to 1 gender ratio is backed up by findings that actually, on average, females require higher levels of autistic traits to receive an ASD diagnosis than do males. So it's almost like they've got to be higher up the spectrum before they actually meet criteria. And also, they tend to require more co-occurring difficulties, high levels of intellectual disability, behavior problems, in order for them to receive an ASD diagnosis compared to males with equivalent levels of autistic traits. So really, when you say, what's the male to female ratio in autism, you have to accept that it varies. The answer you get varies depending on how you identify cases and where you look. So if you just look for people with high autistic traits in the general population, for every 100 people you identified, you would find a little over 30 females. If you looked in the general population, not looking at high trait scorers, but by looking at people who meet diagnostic criteria, that number drops to kind of mid-20s. If you look in the general population for people who have already been diagnosed, the number of females drops further to about 20 per 100. And actually, in many clinics, and including in big, well-known samples, based on clinical diagnosed populations, like the Simon Simplex collection, you find even fewer females per 100, perhaps as few as 10. Yeah. So I take these data and this sort of consideration of variability in the male-to-female ratio to show that we have a clear problem here with the under-ascertainment of females with autism. We're missing them clinically and educationally. And I break this into two parts. Yeah? I think there's a bias that prevents some females who would meet criteria, but something prevents them from actually receiving an assessment, from being sent to the appropriate service and receiving the appropriate assessment. That's one type of bias. And that's demonstrated by the contrast in the passive versus the active epidemiological studies. But then the other type of bias is against, there are some females out there who have very high autistic traits, but for some reason they don't meet diagnostic criteria as often as equivalent males. And that's the bias demonstrated by comparing the 3-to-1 gender ratio in active epidemiological studies with the 2-to-1 gender ratio in autism trait dimension studies. So this, to me, is an important problem. The worry is, and certainly I've seen this clinically and read about it in first-person accounts, and we've come across this in our research, as I'll be talking about. The problem is that there may well be girls out there who need support, who need the understanding that can come with an autism diagnosis, who need support, but who are not getting it because they're being missed, or they're getting it late because they're being picked up late in adolescence and adulthood rather than in childhood. And what I'd like to do now is to talk a bit about what might be causing this bias, because this under-ascertainment of females, because of course, if we want to reverse it, we need to understand it first. And the classic explanation that's given for why there is under-ascertainment of autistic females is that there's something about those females themselves that makes them less likely to be picked up. That there's something about there's a female characteristic presentation, the female autism phenotype, as I call it, and many others do, that doesn't fit well with our conventional definitions of autism, which after all are largely based on male cases. So let's have a think about the female autism phenotype. What are the characteristics of females with autism? I suppose one important point to make here is that I really don't want to come across like I'm sort of talking from men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I wish to try and avoid gross stereotypes about gender. Yeah, because of course, when I say, women with autism like this and men with autism like that, I'm of course talking about averages. I'm talking about tendencies. I'm not trying to say, every woman with autism is like this and every man with autism is totally different. Of course, some of the things I'm going to say about autistic women would actually apply to autistic men as individuals, and vice versa. So I'll try and make sure I don't, make those gross generalizations, but occasionally I might, just because it's sort of, it helps with a sort of shorthand linguistically. Okay, so what are the characteristics of the female autism phenotype? Well, another broad point to make here is that there's a tremendously rich set of information about this that comes from first-person narratives of autistic women, clinical experience, sort of qualitative work, and so on. But we have rather a rich account of the female autism phenotype. What we don't have is a particularly well scientifically validated account of the female autism phenotype. There's lots of good ideas about ways in which autistic women and girls may differ from autistic boys and men, but relatively few of those have actually been kind of tested out scientifically. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try and stick to the characteristics of the female phenotype for which there is some kind of hard scientific evidence. And in cases where I sort of venture into the slightly more anecdotal, I will try and kind of make that clear so people are aware of where the evidence base is here at the moment. So one key characteristic of the female autism phenotype appears to be higher social motivation. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of evidence emerging now, and it certainly fits with my clinical impression and my experiences of talking to autistic women, that on average, autistic women are more interested in the social world than autistic men, on average. Yeah, more interested in making friendships and more interested in kind of understanding and studying the social world. A related point is that this can actually impact strongly upon the sorts of focused interests they have. So, as we know, one of the a key feature of autism, and often a wonderful strength for many autistic people, is this tendency to form quite focused interests that allow them to become particularly expert and knowledgeable on particular topics. And what we're beginning to discover is that, on average, autistic women and girls are more likely to focus their interests on more sort of socially oriented topics versus males who are less likely to have socially oriented focused interests. I remember once giving a talk where a mum stood up, so the mother of an autistic girl, and said, boys are interested in things, girls are interested in people. And of course, it's a generalization, and it doesn't hold in any sense for every boy and every girl. But I thought there was quite a strong grain of truth in that. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. And actually, Rachel, who I mentioned before, has done a kind of pilot study on this very topic to investigate this idea of, is the quality of females' focused interests on the autism spectrum different from that of males. So she made use of the fact that there are lots of ADOS tapes about the place where people have come to be assessed and have undergone this standardized observation designed to kind of elicit whether they have autistic characteristics, and many of these ADOSs are videoed. And she designed a special coding frame to code ADOS videotapes for features of the female phenotype to kind of test out whether there really were gender differences. And this was a good coding frame she made. It was reliable, so it could be applied consistently, even when it was applied by someone other than Rachel. And she has so far done it on 44 ADOS tapes, 22 for females, 22 for males. And these are, for those of you who know about the ADOS, these are module 3 and 4 tapes, because the age range here was 9 to 15 years. So we're talking late childhood and adolescence, and an average IQ of 101. What I wanted to show you was that one of the codes she used was of people's focused interests that they reported in the ADOS. And she coded these as either social, which meant that they were either focused on living beings, humans and animals, or if they weren't focused on human beings, they were explicitly pursued socially, as a shared activity with other individuals and or groups. So she would code focused interests as social or as physical. So these were focused interests that weren't on kind of living beings, or if they were not focused. Did not take place in a social context. They weren't done in a sort of public with other people. They were done in a solitary manner. And what's striking here is that for males, they were much more likely to be coded as having physical interests rather than social ones, whereas for the females, the opposite pattern was observed. And you can see, again, this might accord with some of your own experiences. That, for example, I think it's a tremendously underestimated aspect of autism, but particularly autistic females, that the capacity that many of them have for forming relationships with animals. And you can see here on this slide the high prevalence of autistic girls who are really interested in animals. Okay, so I'll now move on to what I consider the third kind of cardinal evidence-based feature of the female autism phenotype. I mentioned before that autism often goes hand in hand with sort of emotional and behavioural difficulties. So we find that, for example, 50% of kids with autism approximately will have severe anxiety difficulties, and we also see in adulthood anxiety and depression are common, unfortunately, amongst autistic adults, at least in our current kind of cultural economic and social systems. And one idea is that the pattern of co-occurring difficulties is different for males and females. That males are more likely to have externalizing problems, sort of behavior difficulties. Females are more likely to have internalizing problems, anxiety and depression, and eating disorder. And it's that I want to talk about for a few minutes now. This idea that actually one characteristic of the female autism phenotype, but not the male autism phenotype, is a markedly increased risk for developing a restrictive eating disorder, such as anorexia nervosa. So anorexia nervosa, this is diagnosed when a person becomes significantly underweight. due to restricted eating, reflecting the intense fear of putting on weight and a distorted body image. Onset is typically in adolescence and early adulthood. It affects over 10 females to every male, although apparently there is some under ascertainment of males. And actually, I've misspelt something there. I said high rates of morbidity. It's actually high rates of mortality that I should have said there. This is a very dangerous disorder. It's often described as the kind of mental health problem that has the highest rates of mortality of any mental health condition. So on the surface, it doesn't look much like autism, does it? It's about eating, not social life and flexibility. It has an onset in adolescence, whereas autism is obviously a neurodevelopmental condition. It affects more females than males, whereas autism affects more males than females. But surprisingly enough, there does appear to be quite a substantial overlap between anorexia nervosa and autism spectrum conditions. So Chris Gilberg, whose photo you can see here, was one of the earlier people to notice that amongst women that he was meeting with anorexia in his clinical work, actually quite a high proportion of them appeared to have an underlying autism spectrum disorder. And this is work that's been carried on both in America, I'm thinking of Nancy Zucker's work, but also at the Institute of Psychiatry by Janet Treasure and other people like that. And actually, when Gilberg and colleagues did some systematic research into this, following up this cohort of women who'd been diagnosed with anorexia in adolescence, they estimated that around a quarter of them met criteria for autism, which is pretty striking, given, what's the prevalence rate of autism amongst verbally fluent women with an average and above IQ. It's much, much less than 1%. So to find a population where 25% of women have anorexia, have autism, certainly is cause for comment. There's further evidence that maybe autism is a kind of risk factor for the development of anorexia amongst women. So this is another meta-analysis. And what it shows is that if you pool together studies of autistic traits, so not autism diagnoses, but autistic traits, in both adults with anorexia, but also in children with anorexia, you find much higher rates of autistic traits than in the general population, substantially elevated levels of autistic traits. And furthermore, you also find autistic-like sort of cognitive difficulties amongst people who have anorexia, which is again taken, this is what this meta-analysis shows here. So the column on the left shows the kind of average difficulties found on set shifting task, which is a sort of cognitive flexibility measure, which is considered one of the kind of core sort of executive function, cognitive difficulties of autism. You find that both people with anorexia, but also from this right-hand column, people with autism show similar types of executive function, set shifting difficulties. So there's been this kind of growing story that actually, both in terms of diagnosis, in terms of levels of autistic traits, but also in terms of the kind of underlying cognitive profile, there seems to be this overlap between autism and anorexia. And some people have even gone so far, too far in my opinion, in saying, is anorexia the female form of Asperger's? Yeah. Which I think is a grossly exaggerated thing to say, because of course there are many women with Asperger's or with autism who don't have anorexia, and there are many women with anorexia who don't have Asperger's. But what I think is more likely is that for some autistic women, having autism or having autistic traits may well be a risk factor as they enter adolescence for the development of restricted eating difficulties. However, I do want to sound a slight note of caution here. There is a slight problem here, and I think it's led to people to slightly over-exaggerate the link between autism and Asperger's, which is that actually, if you're starved and highly anxious as well, and depressed, you may well look a bit autistic, but you're not actually autistic. So I think there's a group amongst these acutely ill women with anorexia who present in the acute stage of their illness as being autistic, but actually when they recover their weight, they no longer look autistic anymore. So we have to be a little bit careful about exaggerating this phenomenon. But nevertheless, there is still a substantial group of people with anorexia who do genuinely appear to have a long-standing underlying autism spectrum disorder that has contributed to the development of their severe restricted eating problems. Okay, so now let me move on to another aspect of the female autism phenotype, which I've described here as a greater capacity to camouflage autistic difficulties. Yeah. So what do I mean by camouflage? Well, this is how we're defining camouflaging. So camouflaging is the masking of ASD behaviors in social situations and or the performance of behaviors to compensate for difficulties associated with autism. So I think camouflaging was first described by Lorna Wing, the kind of legendary English psychiatrist who did so much to enhance our understanding of autism, introducing concepts like the autism spectrum and the autism triad and so on. And she talks about camouflaging right back in the 70s and 80s. I think camouflaging is wonderfully conveyed by this phrase from Leanne Holiday-Willey, pretending to be normal. Yeah, this is the phrase I hear many autistic people use for what I'm calling camouflaging, this process of masking their behaviors or learning new behaviors to compensate for having for difficulties associated with ASD. And so I think, masking, I think, can be both conscious but also automatic. So, for example, in this study here with Kate Chanturia, 2015, I remember meeting a young woman in an eating disorders clinic who told me that up to the age of about 12 or 13, she would enjoy her stimming behaviors, but she kind of gradually realized as she entered adolescence that actually other people thought they looked quite odd and they can attract negative attention. And she took a conscious decision not to stim in public, but rather to do it in private. So in that sense, she was consciously masking an aspect of her autism. It can also be automatic, I think. So this woman, this paper is no longer under review. Actually, it's published. It's Barjela et al. Paper, said, I do social mimicry against whoever I'm with. I guess it's like a cloaking device. I had no idea that I was doing it until I was diagnosed. So she just automatically found herself copying people around her in order to mask the fact that she didn't feel she knew how to behave in a given situation. So compensation, I distinguish from masking as it's more to do with the kind of acquisition of skills. And so an example of conscious compensation that I came across was, again, a young woman in an eating disorder service who had been diagnosed as having autism in her childhood and had a sister who had autism, and she herself had been expelled from 2 schools and had quite a difficult time of things and a clear neurodevelopmental difficulty. By the time I met her in her early 20s, it was not obvious in any way that she was autistic, but she would tell me about how, as she entered kind of secondary school age, so 12 or 13, she consciously identified a girl in her class who was kind of popular and she thought was a pretty cool girl, and she underwent a concerted campaign of copying that girl, copying how she dressed, copying her gestures, how she talked, and she would go home and practice in front of the mirror some of these gestures. So that's a really clear example, I think, of conscious compensation, the acquisition of skills. But it can also happen automatically, as occurs when kind of conscious compensatory strategies become kind of implicitly learned through repetition. I suppose I'd just like to say one thing about camouflaging. We're researching camouflaging quite a lot at the moment, and I have a PhD student called Laura Hull who's doing some really good work on this. And it's very striking that really, and it's a shame I'm not with you today because I'd love to hear other speakers talking on this topic. I'm beginning to see this as much a political issue as anything else, in the sense that what becomes clear oblige camouflage. They feel that essentially if they don't hide their autistic selves and their autistic behaviors and tastes, they will be kind of at best discriminated against and at worst persecuted. So some people described, a common reason why people start camouflaging is to avoid being bullied. But also, needing to camouflage to get jobs or just to go about their life without being hassled. So, I do think that there's an interesting parallel, even perhaps with gay rights here, in that, of course, there have been times in our history where it was considered very, especially when homosexuality was illegal, as it was in this country for many years, that people felt they had to camouflage the fact that they were gay. And I do wonder, I do hope, I suppose, in 20, 30 years' time, whether autistic people might feel rather less obligation to camouflage their true selves than they do now. Now, so far I've talked cross-sectionally about female autism phenotype, but I'd also like to talk a bit longitudinally, to think about whether there are sort of differences in the developmental trajectories of males and females with autism and with autistic traits. And there's this interesting idea. I'm sure many of you will recognize this chap sitting here in his white coat and his spectacles. That's Hans Asperger in his famous clinic, talking to some of the boys, or talking to one of the boys in his clinic. And Asperger wrote in the 1940s, whilst he was kind of scratching his head and thinking, well, why do I never see girls in my clinic with this autistic psychopathology, as he called it? And this is the answer he came up with. It could be that autistic traits in the female become evident only after puberty. We just do not know. This idea that perhaps in females, the traits only really, or in some females, become much more pronounced and more obvious in adolescence rather than in childhood. And nobody's ever tested that idea, but we recently had a go at doing that using data from a general population sample. So this was in a city in Britain, in the west of England, called Bristol, where there's been an ongoing study going called ALSPAC, where they collected data for everybody born in Bristol in the early 1990s, and they followed them up at several time points. So there has been attrition. Obviously, they don't have data for everybody born in Bristol, but they still have a good representative sample of a sort of the general population in that part of the UK. And they've measured their autistic social traits using something called the Social Communication Disorders Checklist at 4 time points: at 7 years, at 10 years, at 13 years, and at 16 years. And what's interesting is that the trajectories of these traits, and these have been modeled using latent growth curve analysis, but the modeled curves are very similar to the actual means. The trajectories for these traits are different for males and females. So if you look at the red line, that's the boys, and we see they start at age 7 with a higher level of autistic traits than the females, as you would expect. There's this slight dip to age 10, and then a sort of flat trajectory, really, from 10 to 13 to 16. Females, it's a different picture. So they start lower than the boys. They're the blue line. Again, there's this slightly mysterious decline from 7 to 10 years. And then there's this intriguing escalation of difficulties across late childhood and adolescence, such that by the age of 16, the females have caught up with the males in terms of their average scores for autism traits. And actually, if you model the data not in terms of average scores, but in terms of looking what proportion of people score above the clinical cut point on the Social Communication Disorders Checklist, you find the same pattern. So if you look at the bar for 7 years, you can see the blue bar is much taller than the orange bar, showing that a greater proportion of males than of females score above the clinical threshold for having autistic traits. But by the age of 16 years, the bars are pretty equal. Similar numbers of males scoring above threshold for autistic traits. So this is obviously, these are very early findings. I think they're quite provocative and interesting, but and they need to be investigated further. But my take on them, one of the hypotheses I would have about these findings is that actually there is a group of girls who manage, perhaps through camouflaging, to get along up to, let's say in primary education, up to the age of 10 or 11, despite having social communication difficulties. But as the social environment becomes increasingly complex, and we do know that the female social environment from 10 to 16 years, the changing complexity of that is greater than the changing complexity of the average male social environment during that time. As that happens, these girls start to struggle more and more, and their social communication difficulties become more evident. And I think that would fit with the fact that we know that girls receive their diagnosis on average later than males, and also with a lot of the personal stories of autistic women and autistic girls of being kind of ignored and not noticed earlier on in life, and their autistic difficulties only really becoming more prominent in adolescence and early adulthood. But that's an interesting area for future investigation. Is it the case that, as Asperger predicted for sort of 60, 70 years ago, is it the case that part of the female autism phenotype is that autistic difficulties only become more overt a little bit later on in development compared to males? Okay, so far I've been trying to put forward some ideas about the female autism phenotype in the context of trying to understand why there are ascertainment biases against autistic females. And this is the very simple model I've used, really. I sort of said, well, maybe women with autism are on average a bit different to men with autism, and our sort of criteria for what autism looks like is rather male biased, and that's why autistic females get missed. And then another important idea came out that, of course, there's something about the knowledge and the attitudes of key professionals that is creating a barrier in some cases. So clearly this is a slightly horrifying comment here about teachers. I always remember my special needs teacher saying I'm too poor at maths to be autistic. So clearly there's a few things wrong with that, really, isn't there? But the point being that the teacher clearly didn't have much of an understanding about what autism was, and perhaps also not an understanding of how it presents in females. And that's kind of highlighted by this next quote. When I mentioned the possibility to my psychiatric nurse, she actually laughed at me. I asked my mum, who was a GP at the time, and if she thought I was autistic. She said, of course not. At the time, a good 10 years ago now, there just wasn't much information about how girls presented. And from what she knew, I was nothing of the sort. So a couple of important points there. I mean, one is something about the female phenotype that perhaps some professionals aren't aware of. I think another important point that came out of the study was that actually it's often non-specialist professionals, the people who don't specialize in autism. I'm thinking teachers, GPs, which is our word in the UK for a family doctor, mental health workers who are used to working with people with anxiety and depression. They're important people because they're coming across autistic girls and women and have the power to refer them on for specialist assessment. But if they are not properly trained and aware of how autism looks in girls, how the fact that girls do get autism, then you have a barrier because they may not be picking up these girls who need to be referred for appropriate assessment. So I think part of the battle to improving ascertainment of females with autism isn't just going to be about training up highly skilled assessors or developing better instruments. It's going to be about getting people in all aspects of the health and educational system to be a bit more keyed into the female phenotype. So, yeah, just to expand this kind of simple model here, if we're trying to understand the under-ascertainment bias against females with ASD, both the bias against them receiving assessment, but also the bias against them meeting diagnostic criteria, clearly we need to understand individual characteristics, but we also need to understand the kind of features of the environment, be that of the school environment, of the social care environment, of the healthcare environment, that interact with the female phenotype to mean that some females don't get picked up or don't get referred appropriately for assessment. Okay, I'm actually not going to talk about future tasks because it's a slightly methodological and sort of techie thing, and I'd rather use the time to answer some of your questions that I'm assuming would have been emailed through. So I'm going to just say thank you to these people. These are some of the key collaborators who've been really important in this work from a number of institutions. And I'm now going to come out of my slides and have a quick look at the email that I'm expecting would have been sent to me. There's some questions from you guys. Here we go. Thank you, Kim. Okay. Yes. Okay. So this first question I'm going to tackle. I'm assuming I need to finish on the hour. So I've only got 5 minutes. So let me just tackle some of these ones. So this question is, can you speak to the topic of autistic women and misdiagnoses, for example, personality disorders? this is a fascinating question that comes up clinically a lot. I meet a lot of colleagues who work in personality disorder services, who meet women who may well have autism, and there's all these sort of debates about, do they fit a personality disorder diagnosis, like borderline personality? Do they fit an autism diagnosis? I mean, unfortunately, I couldn't name a single research paper on this. So it's clearly an area that we need to research more conceptually, to think about, well, what might be the overlaps, but also just practically to design measures that are capable of distinguishing the two, because I do suspect that there are probably many autistic women who were missed in childhood who are ending up in personality disorder services. So in addition to anorexia, have you found related, less well-known disorders, including ARFID, amongst autistic girls and women? Yes, so that's an important point. So ARFID is this new disorder that was written into DSM-5, and it's, avoidant restricted food intake disorder. And in a sense, this is a disorder that very closely maps onto some of the feeding and eating problems we see experienced by autistic people, especially when they're young. So if you think that fundamentally anorexia, the hallmark of anorexia is weight and shape concerns, a desire to be thin. ARFID is not to do with weight and shape concerns. That's to do with behaviours, just to do with avoidant restricted food intake disorder. So ARFID, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but I would say ARFID is probably very common amongst autistic people, because we know that there are these sort of sensory-driven eating difficulties in some members of that population, but it's as is implied by the question, it's a different thing to anorexia. Okay, I'm going to read this one out. So someone says, because I'm good at camouflaging, I only recently got a diagnosis of ASD. I was diagnosed with many other mental illnesses at first. I found not so many psychologists, especially in ASD, are specialising in ASD and are qualified to give diagnosis. How do you think these females can reach diagnosis more smoothly? And what do you think we need to improve? I'm on the spectrum and doing research on ASD. So that's very interesting experience. So, because of course the women that we spoke to lived in the UK, I'm assuming that the person asking this question lives in the USA, but a very similar experience to this experience of being diagnosed with many other mental illnesses. I mean, I would say what we need to do to improve is to raise awareness of autism and how it presents in autistic women, and particularly autistic women with fluent language and high IQ, but to raise it amongst mental health practitioners, GPs, teachers, people who wouldn't necessarily see themselves as needing to know about autism. And I also know that certainly at a university in the county of Kent around here, people are currently developing a specific measure that is designed to pick up autism in females presenting at mental health services. So work is being done on better screening measures as well that could help to deal with this. Okay, are there other meta-analytic studies on other diagnostic categories that reflect similar gender bias? Is this social construct unique to ASD? So the notion that this is a social construct is interesting. I suppose that takes us into a whole other domain of, I had the pleasure of hearing Roy Grinker speak last night, who would certainly say, from GWU, who would certainly say that autism is a social construct. I'm going to slightly sidestep that, but say that what is interesting is that there is a male preponderance in a number of neurodevelopmental difficulties. So there is something about being male that makes you more vulnerable in females to ADHD, to Tourette's, to stammering, and so on. So other things to do with the kind of early developments of the brain. And I suppose it's worth saying, I don't think the gender ratio in autism is 1-to-1. I do think males are more vulnerable to autism. I just think we've exaggerated it up to now. Yeah. So I am going to finish there, just because I'm going to keep to time. And so I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening, and do feel free to send me questions or comments via Twitter if you'd like to sort of continue this debate and haven't had the chance to answer a question. I'm sorry if you asked a question and I didn't have time to answer it. But thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.